Imagine for a moment the fog settling over the streets of Boston. The city, which seems to breathe with the pulse of its people, is shrouded in darkness, where whispers carry secrets that not even the bravest dare to uncover. Amidst this uncertainty, there exists a figure whose name still sends a shiver down the spine of anyone who dares speak it: James Whitey Bulger. A man who mastered the underworld and lived by a code that made him both untouchable and feared by those who ran the very system that was supposed to stop him. It was in the shadows of Boston's gritty streets, with its decaying brick buildings and the ever-present smell of the sea, that Bulger's empire was born, nurtured, and left to fester for decades. But how did a man who was already a notorious criminal, capable of terrifying even his closest allies, come to be more than just a gangster? How did he become an informant, a betrayer of his own kind, while still maintaining his iron grip on the underworld? These questions, unanswered for so long, are the key to understanding the tangled web that Bulger wove. What happened next would shock even his most trusted accomplices, and it would leave a trail of corruption, violence, and betrayal in its wake. Born into the unforgiving streets of South Boston, Whitey Bulger didn't have the luxury of an easy childhood. His family was poor, and his early years were shaped by struggle and hardship. The neighborhood itself was a breeding ground for crime, and the young Bulger soon learned that the world he lived in was harsh, unforgiving, and indifferent to dreams. His formative years were spent learning the rules of survival, the unspoken rules that governed the lives of the people around him. His rise to power wasn't accidental. It was a matter of necessity. To survive in South Boston, you had to be tough, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to rise above the squalor. And Whitey, with his piercing blue eyes and cold, calculating nature, was ready to take on that challenge. He wasn't always the violent kingpin that history remembers him as. In the beginning, Bulger was just another ambitious young man trying to escape the clutches of poverty. But ambition, once it takes root, grows quickly. By his late teens, Bulger was already associating with some of the most dangerous men in the city. He found his place among the Winter Hill Gang, a criminal organization that operated in the heart of Boston. The group had its hands in everything from illegal gambling to loan sharking and drug trafficking. But what set Whitey apart from the others was his ability to read people, to manipulate situations, and to use fear as a weapon. He didn't need to rely on brute force alone. He had something much more dangerous, a sharp mind and an uncanny ability to make people believe that crossing him was the worst decision they could make. It wasn't long before Bulger's reputation grew. His ruthless business practices and ability to eliminate his rivals made him an invaluable asset to the Winter Hill Gang. His rise was swift, but it wasn't without obstacles. As he climbed the ladder of the criminal underworld, he found that he had to step over bodies, both metaphorically and literally. Those who stood in his way didn't stand a chance. Bulger's rise to power was defined by a series of brutal decisions. He was willing to do anything to solidify his position, including betraying those closest to him. Friends were discarded, family members were manipulated, and anyone who showed signs of disloyalty was eliminated without hesitation. As his power grew, so did his confidence. He knew he was untouchable, not just because of his criminal prowess, but because of his relationship with the FBI. Yes, you heard that correctly, Whitey Bulger, the very man who controlled an empire built on fear, was also working with the FBI. This revelation, when it first came to light, shook the very foundation of Boston's criminal justice system. How could the same man who was responsible for countless murders and crimes be working with the authorities meant to stop him? The answer lies in the dark and twisted world of informants and corruption. The FBI, desperate to take down the Italian mafia in Boston, saw Bulger as a valuable ally. They offered him a deal that would change the course of his life, and his story. In exchange for providing information on the mafia, Bulger was promised protection and immunity from prosecution. It was a dangerous game, one that would blur the lines between right and wrong, and one that would have far-reaching consequences. But in the world of Whitey Bulger, loyalty was a currency that he controlled. While the FBI believed they were using him to infiltrate the mafia, Bulger had his own agenda. He used the information he provided to further his own interests, taking down rivals while building his empire in the shadows. The relationship between Bulger and the FBI was a tangled mess of mutual manipulation. On the surface, Bulger was the perfect informant, feeding the FBI valuable intelligence about the mafia. But underneath it all, he was playing both sides, using his position as an informant to eliminate anyone who posed a threat to his business and to further entrench himself in power. This double life continued for years. Bulger's influence over both the criminal underworld and law enforcement was unparalleled. He had the city in his grip, and no one dared to challenge him. But as the years went on, things began to change. Bulger's grip on the underworld started to slip. The mafia was no longer his only competition, rivals from other criminal organizations began to encroach on his territory. And the FBI, once his ally, began to turn its attention toward him. The very system that had protected him for so long now seemed determined to bring him down. Whitey Bulger's world was crumbling around him, but he wasn't one to go down without a fight. The decision was made, he had to disappear. Whitey Bulger went into hiding, leaving behind a city that was increasingly unraveling. For 16 years, he lived as a ghost, changing identities, traveling across the country, and leaving behind no trace of his existence. But despite his best efforts, the past never stays buried for long. The hunt for Whitey Bulger became a national obsession. The FBI, along with various law enforcement agencies, spent years searching for the man who had once been their informant. But no one could find him. The man who had once ruled Boston with an iron fist had vanished into thin air. It wasn't until 2011, 16 years after he went into hiding, that Whitey Bulger was finally captured. His arrest was the culmination of years of investigation, and it shocked the nation. The man who had evaded justice for so long was now facing the consequences of his actions. But even in custody, Bulger remained a mystery. The story of his life, the tale of betrayal and manipulation, left people wondering how someone so feared and powerful could have lived such a life of deception. Bulger's story wasn't just one of crime, it was a story of a man who played a dangerous game with no regard for the rules. It was a story of a man who mastered the art of deception, leaving everyone who crossed his path to wonder, who was Whitey Bulger, really? In the heart of South Boston, amidst the clamor of busy streets and the scent of the salty ocean air, a young James Joseph Bulger, later known as Whitey, came into a world that offered few options for escape. It was a world where survival wasn't a guarantee but a daily struggle, where trust was scarce, and loyalty was more often a weapon than a virtue. Bulger's early years were shaped by these harsh realities, and the brutal neighborhood he was born into would go on to shape him in ways that he would never be able to outrun. The icy winter winds, the worn brick walls of the row houses, and the faint hum of the docks all became part of the fabric of his life. But beneath the surface of this working-class neighborhood, where every man seemed to be fighting for his piece of the American dream, there was a different undercurrent, one that would beckon young Whitey in the direction of power and violence. Bulger's family was poor, with limited means and even fewer opportunities. His father, a laborer, worked long hours but still struggled to make ends meet. His mother, who had come from a long line of Irish immigrants, tried to hold the family together with love and discipline, but the pressures of their economic situation made even the simplest goals feel out of reach. The sense of hopelessness was palpable, and it wasn't long before Whitey, as he would later be known, began to realize that the streets of South Boston could offer him something more than what his family could provide. The streets were not only a battleground for survival, but they also provided a certain kind of freedom, a freedom that came with power, respect, and the ability to call the shots. It wasn't that Whitey was born a criminal, nor was he predisposed to a life of lawlessness from the start. His early years were full of the typical challenges faced by any child growing up in a tough neighborhood. But there was something about Bulger that set him apart. He had a sharp mind, an intuition that allowed him to read people like an open book, and a ruthlessness that he quickly learned could be an asset. In a neighborhood where respect was earned through fear and power, Whitey wasn't content to stay on the sidelines. He knew from a young age that the way to rise above the squalor of his environment was through force, through the ability to make others listen and obey, whether they wanted to or not. As a teenager, Bulger's ambitions began to take shape. The corner store, the local bar, the alleys behind the schools, these were the spaces where young men like Whitey learned the unspoken rules of the game. They weren't taught in books or schools, but on the streets, from older men who had long since learned what it meant to survive in a world where violence was often the only currency that mattered. Whitey began to form connections with these men, his charisma and quick wit helping him climb the social ladder of South Boston's criminal underworld. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, and he quickly earned a reputation for being willing to do what others wouldn't. Bulger's introduction to the world of organized crime was not a fluke. It was a natural progression, a step toward the inevitable. The Winter Hill Gang, a group that operated just on the fringes of Boston's larger mafia presence, was looking for new recruits, and Bulger, with his sharp mind and his emerging street savvy, was the perfect candidate. At the time, the Winter Hill Gang was a relatively small outfit, focused on street-level crime like loan sharking, racketeering, and extortion. But as Whitey worked his way into their ranks, it became clear that he wasn't content to play second fiddle. He wanted more. He wanted power. And he would stop at nothing to get it. The Winter Hill Gang had been around for decades, operating in the shadows of Boston's larger criminal syndicates. They were known for their ruthless business dealings and their ability to stay just under the radar of law enforcement. But the gang wasn't invincible, and it had its share of problems, both internally and externally. Whitey, ever the opportunist, saw the cracks in the organization and positioned himself to exploit them. Over time, he would rise from a mere soldier in the gang to its undisputed leader. But this wouldn't happen overnight. It would take cunning, patience, and the willingness to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. As he moved up the ranks, Bulger began to understand the value of loyalty, at least, loyalty from those he could manipulate. He quickly became adept at playing the psychological game that was a constant in the criminal world. He knew how to make people fear him, but more importantly, he knew how to make them trust him. In a world where everyone was constantly looking over their shoulder, wondering when they might be betrayed or turned in by an ally, Whitey became a master of manipulation. He learned to make promises that he never intended to keep, to smile in a man's face while plotting his downfall behind his back. In the world of organized crime, this was both an art and a survival mechanism. The city of Boston, with its rich history and storied past, became the backdrop for Bulger's rise to power. As he built his empire, he encountered other criminals who shared his ambition, but he quickly realized that the key to controlling Boston was not just about being tougher or smarter, it was about connections. The real power in the city wasn't just in the hands of the mafia, it was also in the hands of the city's politicians, law enforcement, and those who worked behind the scenes, making deals and turning a blind eye to the criminal activity that flourished in the shadows. Bulger began to cultivate these relationships, forging alliances with people who could help him expand his reach and protect him from the law. What made Bulger so dangerous wasn't just his ambition, it was his ability to blend into the world he was trying to control. While most criminals reveled in their notoriety, Whitey understood that true power came from remaining hidden, from operating in the shadows. He knew how to keep his face out of the papers and his name off the police radar. He didn't need the world to know who he was, he just needed them to know that crossing him would be the last mistake they ever made. As Bulger's influence grew, so did his paranoia. He began to believe that the world was out to get him, that his rise to the top had made him a target not just for other criminals, but for the very system he had worked so hard to manipulate. It was around this time that the FBI, desperate to bring down the Italian mafia and other criminal organizations, turned to Bulger. They saw him as an informant, a tool to infiltrate the mafia from within. Bulger, of course, saw this as an opportunity. He didn't care about the FBI or the mafia, he cared about staying on top, about maintaining his grip on Boston, and about never getting caught. And so, in a twist of fate that would forever change the course of his life, Bulger agreed to become an informant. The FBI, blinded by their need for inside information, never realized they were being played by one of the most dangerous criminals in the country. Bulger, with his icy demeanor and calculating mind, fed them just enough information to keep them at bay, all the while using their trust to further his own agenda. As his power within the Winter Hill Gang continued to grow, so did his control over the FBI. The two forces, law enforcement and organized crime, were now inextricably linked, and Whitey Bulger, the man who once came from nothing, had risen to become the puppet master of both worlds. But the higher you climb, the harder you fall. Whitey Bulger's rise within the criminal underworld was no mere stroke of luck. It was a calculated, deliberate ascent that was marked by sharp instincts, an unyielding desire for power, and a brutal willingness to do whatever it took to get ahead. His early days in the Winter Hill Gang were formative, but the true extent of his potential wasn't realized until he began to exert his influence over the gang's operations. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied on brute force alone, Whitey understood that success in the criminal world was about more than just muscle, it was about strategy, timing, and knowing when to strike. As a young member of the gang, he started to take note of the opportunities around him, seizing control of territories that had once been owned by rival factions. Whitey's success within the Winter Hill Gang wasn't accidental, but a matter of opportunity. His sharp mind and cunning nature quickly drew the attention of both gang members and rival criminals. Bulger wasn't just another enforcer, he had the ability to make deals, broker alliances, and manipulate situations to his advantage. His approach to the underworld was different from many of the seasoned veterans around him. Where others were content to simply collect their earnings and maintain their status quo, Whitey was always looking for the next step, always thinking about how to outmaneuver those around him, even if it meant leaving bodies in his wake. It wasn't long before he proved himself not just as a capable member of the Winter Hill Gang but as a key player who could be trusted with the toughest assignments. But while his ambitions were growing, so too were the dangers that came with living in the world of organized crime. Every move Whitey made was fraught with peril, as every gang member knew that in the underworld, your success was often measured by how many enemies you had made. In order to solidify his position, Whitey started eliminating threats in the most ruthless way possible. There were whispers in the streets, rumors of men who crossed Whitey, only to never be seen again. He didn't just take out those who posed a direct threat to his business, he targeted anyone who could potentially disrupt the power structure he was carefully building. Rival gang members, traitors, and even former allies were fair game. The brutality of his rise was striking, but it was also part of the territory. In a world where power was the ultimate currency, Whitey had learned the hard truth: to stay on top, you had to eliminate anyone who might challenge you. His ambition didn't stop at just the Winter Hill Gang, he began to make moves on a larger stage. Whitey knew that if he was ever going to be more than just another mobster, he needed to expand his reach. The mafia, long the dominant force in Boston's criminal underworld, had controlled the city's illicit businesses for decades. But Whitey saw cracks in their armor, weaknesses he could exploit. He was no longer content with running petty rackets, he wanted to control the city, its streets, and its businesses. To achieve that, he had to outmaneuver the mafia. This was where Whitey's true brilliance shone. Unlike the mafia, which operated with a strict code of honor and loyalty, Bulger was willing to play dirty. He wasn't concerned with traditions or the rules that governed the mafia's operations. He cared only about one thing: power. And for Whitey Bulger, that power came through his ability to manipulate, deceive, and control every piece of the puzzle. He understood that fear could be more powerful than respect, and he wielded it with the skill of a master. He manipulated situations so that his rivals would be too distracted or too frightened to notice that he was slowly tightening his grip around the city. But it wasn't just fear that made Bulger successful, it was his ability to adapt. While the mafia adhered to rigid rules and long-standing traditions, Whitey was more fluid, more willing to bend the rules to suit his needs. He didn't just focus on one type of crime, he diversified. His hands were in everything, from drug trafficking to loan sharking, from extortion to illegal gambling. No business was too small, no deal too insignificant. If it made money, Whitey was involved. This made him not only a powerful figure within the Winter Hill Gang but also an increasingly prominent force in Boston's criminal ecosystem. But Bulger wasn't just expanding his operations, he was also consolidating power in a way that was uniquely his own. He began to build an infrastructure that made his criminal empire more resilient and difficult to dismantle. He worked with corrupt law enforcement officials and politicians, forging relationships that would serve him well when things inevitably went wrong. He knew that in order to stay untouchable, he needed to ensure that no one in Boston, be it a police officer, a judge, or a politician, could ever turn against him. So, he began feeding them information, bribing them, and using them as pawns in his game. In return, they looked the other way, allowing him to carry out his criminal activities with impunity. But even with all of this power, Whitey Bulger was always looking over his shoulder. No one in the underworld was truly safe, and no one ever stayed on top forever. For every ally Whitey made, there was someone waiting for the right moment to betray him. The higher he climbed, the more people he alienated, and the more enemies he made. Bulger was well aware of this, which is why he surrounded himself with loyal followers, men who would do anything for him. He cultivated a small circle of trusted associates who, like him, had no qualms about using violence to achieve their goals. This small but loyal group of men helped him maintain control of his empire, making sure that anyone who dared challenge Whitey was dealt with swiftly and decisively. Yet, for all of Whitey's ruthless actions and carefully executed power grabs, there was one crucial factor that made his rise to dominance possible: his relationship with the FBI. The FBI, desperate to infiltrate the mafia and other criminal organizations in Boston, needed an insider. They needed someone who knew the streets, who understood how organized crime worked from the inside. And Whitey, always calculating, saw an opportunity. He knew that the FBI could be a powerful tool, one that could not only help him avoid prosecution but also allow him to take down his rivals. It was a match made in the most dangerous of circumstances. The decision to become an informant wasn't one that Bulger took lightly. He wasn't motivated by any sense of duty or justice. Instead, his choice was driven purely by self-interest. In exchange for providing the FBI with information about the mafia, he was promised protection from prosecution and immunity from the law. Whitey, ever the opportunist, saw this as a golden chance to manipulate the very system that was meant to stop him. He could now play both sides, controlling the streets while feeding the authorities just enough information to keep them at bay. The FBI, blinded by their need for an informant, never realized that they were being played by one of the most dangerous men in the city. At the same time, Whitey was expanding his criminal operations, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in Boston's underworld. His grip on the city was growing stronger by the day. He continued to eliminate those who stood in his way, expanding his empire to cover every aspect of criminal activity in the city. And through it all, he remained untouchable, protected by the very system that should have been working to bring him down. The city that had once been his battleground was now completely under his control, and Whitey Bulger had become one of the most powerful and feared figures in Boston's criminal history. But with power comes danger, and no empire, no matter how solid it seems, lasts forever. Whitey Bulger's decision to become an FBI informant was nothing short of a masterstroke in the twisted game of survival he had been playing for most of his life. On the surface, it might seem paradoxical: how could the leader of a feared criminal empire, a man known for his brutal tactics and ruthless ambition, turn into a snitch, an informant feeding information to the very institution that sought to bring him down? But to Bulger, it was all part of the strategy. He wasn't motivated by loyalty to the government or any idealistic desire to take down the mafia. No, for him, this was just another play in the dangerous game he had been perfecting his entire life. He had spent years manipulating the streets, his gang, his enemies, and even the law. Now, it was time to manipulate the FBI. In exchange for becoming an informant, Bulger was promised immunity from prosecution, something that many would have thought was impossible for someone with his history. His rise to the top had been built on a foundation of bloodshed, betrayal, and intimidation. Yet, with the FBI now in his corner, his position was suddenly more secure than ever before. He had always been a master of playing both sides, but this was a new level of manipulation. With the FBI believing that they had recruited him as an insider in the battle against the mafia, Bulger saw an opportunity to control not just the underworld but also the law enforcement that was supposed to take him down. But Whitey didn't just feed the FBI information to help them take down the mafia, he used this position of power to further his own agenda. The FBI became a tool for him, a means to eliminate threats to his empire without ever having to lift a finger. He could get rid of competitors, keep his rivals off his back, and protect his criminal operations, all under the guise of helping law enforcement. The FBI believed they were using him to infiltrate the mafia and other criminal syndicates, but in reality, Bulger was using them to cover his tracks and further entrench himself in power. He was playing them, just as he had played everyone else in his life. For the FBI, the collaboration with Bulger seemed to be a perfect arrangement. They had no idea that the man they had recruited to fight crime was simultaneously orchestrating an empire of violence and corruption. Bulger, with his insider knowledge, became an invaluable asset. He fed them details about the mafia's movements, their plans, their operations. But as the years went on, the scope of his betrayal became clearer. The FBI, despite their best efforts, had been blind to the fact that the man they trusted was, in fact, working with the very people they were trying to dismantle. The more they trusted him, the more dangerous his influence became. What made Bulger's double life even more remarkable was his ability to maintain the illusion of trustworthiness. To the FBI agents handling him, he was just another informant, perhaps more valuable than most, but still, just a tool to gather intelligence. Yet, behind their backs, he was using them as pawns in his greater game. He made sure that he fed them just enough information to keep them satisfied but withheld crucial details that could have led to his undoing. He carefully cultivated relationships with those in the FBI who would protect him, all the while feeding them just enough to stay out of prison. The complexity of his operation is almost unimaginable. On one side, he was feeding information to the FBI, helping them build cases against his rivals in the mafia. On the other, he was simultaneously eliminating those rivals in the underworld, using his newfound power to destroy anyone who stood in his way. His ability to manipulate both the criminal world and law enforcement at the same time is a testament to just how dangerous Whitey Bulger really was. He was playing a game where the stakes were life and death, and he was playing it better than anyone else. But Bulger wasn't just a cold and calculating criminal mastermind, he was also a master of survival. He knew that in the world of organized crime, things could turn on a dime. Even the most powerful figures had a shelf life. For him, this arrangement with the FBI was not just a way to protect himself from the law, but also a way to ensure that no one could ever take him down. The system that was designed to catch criminals had become a shield for him, allowing him to operate with impunity while continuing his reign over Boston's underworld. But Bulger's success was never guaranteed. The very system he had exploited for so long was starting to show cracks. As his influence over the mafia and the streets of Boston grew, so too did the risk of exposure. For every ally Bulger made, there were dozens of potential enemies waiting for the right moment to strike. And despite his ability to manipulate the situation, there was always the possibility that the FBI would eventually turn on him. The very people who had once considered him a valuable informant could, at any time, decide that they no longer needed him or that he had become too dangerous to allow to continue operating unchecked. This ever-present danger is what made Bulger's life a delicate balancing act. He couldn't afford to trust anyone, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. His paranoia grew as his empire expanded. Even within his own criminal circle, there were those who questioned his loyalty. Bulger's ability to control the Winter Hill Gang, to keep them in line and prevent any dissent, was another testament to his iron grip on the underworld. He ruled through fear, intimidation, and manipulation, always ensuring that no one ever had the chance to overtake him. But the very tactics that kept him at the top also made him a target. Even as he expanded his empire, Bulger found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, wondering when the next betrayal would come. His paranoia grew with each passing year, until it became a defining characteristic of his rule. He couldn't trust his own people, and he certainly couldn't trust the FBI, despite the protection they offered him. As the years wore on, the danger of his situation began to catch up with him. He was a criminal in an ever-shrinking world, his empire was vast, but the walls were closing in. The betrayal of Bulger, however, wasn't just about him turning on his criminal counterparts. It was also about his betrayal of the FBI. The very institution that had given him immunity from prosecution, that had trusted him, was now faced with the possibility that their trusted informant had been lying to them all along. His double life, the life that no one in law enforcement could see, was a testament to his manipulation. He had convinced the FBI that he was their ally, while simultaneously using them to cover up his criminal activity and eliminate anyone who dared to challenge him. In the end, it was this duality, this ability to straddle two worlds with ease, that made Whitey Bulger such a formidable figure. He wasn't just a gangster or a criminal, he was a master manipulator who knew how to use the system to his advantage. And for a time, it worked. The FBI, blinded by their own desire to bring down the mafia, never realized that they were being played by the one person who had managed to outwit everyone, even the people who were supposed to bring him to justice. As time went on, however, the cracks in the system started to show. The FBI's trust in Bulger began to wane, and it became clear that his reign over Boston's underworld was beginning to unravel. He had played both sides for so long, and for so well, that he had come to believe he could never be caught. But the truth was that no one, not even the most powerful criminal mastermind, can hide forever. And though Bulger had escaped justice for years, his time was running out. The walls were closing in, and the consequences of his betrayals were beginning to take shape. The man who had once controlled the underworld was now at the mercy of the very system he had used to protect himself. For all the power Whitey Bulger wielded in the shadows of Boston, the cracks in his empire had begun to show. His empire had flourished under a delicate balance of fear, manipulation, and calculated deceit. He had used his criminal genius to rise above everyone else, his relationship with the FBI providing him with an additional layer of protection that few in the criminal world could ever imagine. But the very system that had shielded him for years was also the one that would ultimately contribute to his undoing. As the years went on, it became clear that Whitey's hold on Boston was not as secure as it once had been. His paranoia, a constant companion for most of his adult life, began to escalate as he became increasingly aware of the danger he faced. His ability to trust anyone had dwindled to nearly zero. He had learned the hard way that in his line of work, everyone was expendable, even the closest of allies. Whitey's willingness to betray his own family, friends, and associates had made him a dangerous figure in the underworld, but it also made him a vulnerable one. He no longer had the luxury of blind trust, and the very alliances that had helped him climb to the top were now the ones that could lead to his downfall. Each new betrayal, each piece of the puzzle that fell into place, was a reminder of just how fragile his position really was. Whitey had spent years building his criminal empire by leveraging fear and loyalty. His brutal tactics had silenced anyone who questioned him, and his cold, calculating nature had made him an effective leader. But the more power he accumulated, the more his paranoia grew. He began to see threats where none existed. Former allies were suddenly viewed as potential traitors. Friends were now enemies in waiting. Bulger's world, once so carefully controlled, was starting to feel like a house of cards, each moment threatening to bring it all crashing down. The paranoia that had served him so well in his rise to power now clouded his judgment, making it difficult for him to trust even those who had been loyal to him for years. As the Winter Hill Gang continued to thrive under his leadership, new forces were beginning to encroach on his territory. Rival gangs, once wary of Whitey's power, were beginning to grow bolder. The streets of Boston, once firmly under his control, were now a battleground. Whitey's empire was no longer as invulnerable as it once seemed. In the criminal world, power was fleeting, and Whitey knew that better than anyone. His enemies were closing in, and it wasn't just the rival gang members or the law enforcement that posed a threat, it was the very system he had manipulated for so long. The FBI, his former protector, had started to grow suspicious of him. His time as an informant had given him a temporary advantage, but the same system that had once protected him was now beginning to see through the facade. In the years following his decision to become an informant, Whitey had come to believe that he was untouchable. He had played both sides for so long, with such deft skill, that it was difficult for him to imagine that anyone could bring him down. But the more time passed, the more the walls began to close in. The FBI's investigation into Bulger became more aggressive as agents began to piece together the truth, that the very man who had been providing them with crucial information about the mafia was also the one who had been running the show in Boston, eliminating anyone who stood in his way. The FBI had been blind to his true nature, and now, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Bulger was no longer the helpful informant feeding them valuable intelligence, he was the criminal mastermind they had been trying to catch for decades. The realization that his own informant had been playing them was a hard pill to swallow for the FBI. Bulger had manipulated the system so thoroughly that, at first, it was hard to believe. But the evidence was mounting. The FBI had been looking for answers to questions that Bulger had carefully kept hidden, and now, those questions were beginning to surface. The trust that had once existed between Bulger and his handlers began to crack, and with it came the knowledge that the walls of his empire were finally beginning to crumble. But even as the investigation into his actions ramped up, Bulger remained elusive, the embodiment of the criminal mastermind who always seemed to stay one step ahead. He knew that the longer he stayed out of sight, the more his rivals would slip up, the more law enforcement would become obsessed with finding him. And so, in 1994, after years of evading arrest, Whitey Bulger disappeared from Boston, vanishing into thin air as though he had never existed at all. It was as if the man who had once ruled Boston's underworld with an iron fist had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind a city that was now in turmoil. The Boston Globe's headlines screamed for answers, and the public was left in shock. How could a man so powerful, so dangerous, simply vanish? The man who had once been the face of organized crime in Boston was now a ghost, and the city was left reeling. But for Whitey, this was no defeat, it was just another chapter in his long-running game. He had successfully evaded the law before, and now he would do it again. His disappearance sparked one of the largest manhunts in FBI history. The agency, along with local law enforcement, launched a nationwide search for the fugitive. Whitey had become one of the FBI's most wanted criminals, and the case became a national obsession. For years, there were no leads, no sightings. It seemed as though he had simply vanished into thin air, taking with him the secrets of his criminal empire and the betrayals that had allowed him to operate with impunity for so long. In the meantime, Bulger lived a life of near-constant relocation. He moved across the country, constantly changing identities, staying in the shadows, and hiding in plain sight. He was a man on the run, but even in hiding, his influence still reached out from the darkness. The very system that had once protected him had become the thing he feared the most. His paranoia, once a tool of survival, now became his prison. The constant fear of being discovered, of being hunted down, weighed heavily on him. But he had lived his life in the shadows for so long that disappearing didn't seem all that difficult. However, despite his best efforts to stay hidden, Whitey's past would eventually catch up with him. The FBI's pursuit of him never stopped. For 16 years, he remained on the run, and during that time, his legend only grew. He became a ghost story, a myth told by those who still remembered the terror he had caused. But even as the years passed and the hunt grew colder, the FBI never let up. Eventually, in 2011, Bulger's time on the run came to an end. The fugitive who had eluded capture for so long was finally tracked down in Santa Monica, California. The man who had once been the kingpin of Boston's underworld was now in FBI custody, and the world would finally get a chance to see the man behind the myth. The news of his arrest sent shockwaves through the nation. Whitey Bulger, the man who had ruled with a brutal fist, was finally caught. But even in custody, he remained a mystery. The story of his life, of his betrayal, his manipulation, and his rise to power, was far from over. The man who had once been untouchable now faced a reckoning, and the world was eager to see how the story would unfold. But for all the years of deception, for all the lives he had ruined, Whitey Bulger's story would eventually be told, and the empire he had built would be torn apart. The arrest of Whitey Bulger in 2011 marked the culmination of years of painstaking investigation and relentless pursuit. For 16 years, he had evaded capture, a ghost haunting the streets of Boston, a name whispered in the shadows of the criminal underworld. His disappearance had been a masterstroke in its own right, a careful, calculated move that exemplified everything he had come to represent: control, manipulation, and survival. To those who had once feared him, the moment of his capture was both a victory and a shock. Bulger, a man who had spent his life outwitting both criminals and law enforcement, had finally been caught. Yet, even in custody, his story was far from over. The world had watched as this enigmatic figure, this ruthless mastermind, had operated with near impunity for decades. But now, as he faced justice, the question on everyone's mind was, what was next for Whitey Bulger? After his capture in Santa Monica, California, Whitey Bulger was extradited back to Boston, where he would stand trial for a litany of charges ranging from racketeering to multiple murders. His trial would become a spectacle, a long-awaited reckoning for the man who had terrorized the city for so many years. The truth of Bulger's crimes, his double life as an FBI informant, and the corruption that had enabled his reign over Boston's criminal underworld began to surface. But there was something chilling about the way Whitey Bulger carried himself in the wake of his arrest. He seemed unfazed, almost detached from the gravity of his actions. It was as if, even now, he believed himself to be untouchable, the same man who had orchestrated a lifetime of betrayal, violence, and manipulation. The trial itself was a gripping affair. As the charges against him were laid out, the scope of his criminal activity became painfully clear. Bulger had been involved in everything, from drug trafficking to extortion to loan sharking. His fingerprints were all over Boston's criminal enterprises, and the damage he had caused extended far beyond just the lives he had destroyed. He had infiltrated the very institutions meant to protect the public: the police, the courts, the government. Bulger's relationship with the FBI, once an asset that protected him from prosecution, became the central point of his trial. It was revealed that he had been not just an informant, but a manipulator who had used his position to eliminate rivals, intimidate witnesses, and escape justice. The very system that had worked with him had allowed him to build an empire of fear and corruption, and now, that same system would turn against him. But the trial was not just about Bulger's crimes, it was also about the people who had enabled him. The FBI agents who had turned a blind eye to his activities, the corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials who had allowed him to thrive, were all implicated in the case. The trial brought to light the deep levels of corruption within the very institutions that were supposed to protect the public from men like Bulger. His case was a damning indictment of the system itself, a system that had failed not only the citizens of Boston but also the very agents who thought they were in control. As the trial unfolded, Whitey Bulger remained a stoic figure, his emotions carefully controlled. The public, however, was riveted by his demeanor, by the cold, calculating gaze that seemed to look through the courtroom as if he were still in charge. His arrogance, his belief that he was above it all, never wavered. Even as the evidence mounted against him, Bulger never seemed to fully grasp the extent of his fall. To him, he had always been the master of his fate, the one pulling the strings, the one who had orchestrated every twist and turn of his criminal empire. And so, in the courtroom, he continued to play his part, silent, unrepentant, almost detached from the human suffering that had been caused by his actions. The trial lasted for months, and as the evidence was presented, the extent of Bulger's manipulation became ever clearer. The lives of those he had betrayed, the families of the victims whose lives he had taken, were laid bare for the public to see. For those who had lived in the shadow of Bulger's empire, it was a moment of reckoning. They finally had the chance to confront the man who had haunted their lives for so long. But for Bulger, the trial was just another stage, another game where he believed he could control the outcome. Even as he was convicted on numerous charges, including 11 counts of murder, he seemed to maintain his indifference, as if the consequences of his actions were simply a matter of course, an inevitable part of the world he had created. But the trial wasn't just a spectacle for the public, it was also a deep dive into the complex psychology of Whitey Bulger. Behind his cold exterior, there was a man who had spent his entire life manipulating those around him, using fear as his primary tool for control. The more the world learned about his life, the more his ability to manipulate became apparent. He had used everyone around him, his associates, his family, even the FBI agents who had once trusted him. Bulger's entire life had been a series of manipulations, of betrayals, of calculated moves designed to keep him on top. And now, as he faced the consequences of his actions, it seemed that even in his darkest moments, he could still see himself as the hero of his own story. For many, Bulger's trial was a moment of justice, a long-awaited reckoning for the man who had escaped punishment for so long. But for some, it was a reminder of the ways in which the system had failed them. The FBI's involvement in his crimes, the corruption that had allowed him to thrive, and the damage he had done to so many lives left a bitter taste in the mouths of those who had suffered at his hands. The trial was not just about punishing Bulger, it was about holding accountable all those who had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. And as the trial came to a close and Bulger was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, many were left wondering how he had managed to evade justice for so long. How had the system allowed a man like Bulger to operate with such impunity? The question would linger long after the trial ended, a reminder of the dangers of corruption and the ways in which power could be manipulated to serve the interests of the few. But even in prison, Bulger's story was far from over. His time behind bars became another chapter in the saga of Whitey Bulger, a man who had spent his life outsmarting those who tried to bring him down. He had been convicted, but in many ways, the true consequences of his actions were still unfolding. The families of his victims would never get their loved ones back. The city of Boston would never fully recover from the years of fear and corruption that Bulger had instilled in it. And the legacy of his life, his ability to manipulate, to betray, and to control, would continue to haunt those who had been caught in his web. In the end, Whitey Bulger's arrest and subsequent conviction were not just the end of a criminal empire, but the beginning of a much larger conversation about the intersection of crime and corruption, law enforcement and betrayal. His story was one of manipulation, power, and survival, but it was also a story of the failures of the system itself. The FBI, law enforcement, and even the city of Boston had all played a role in enabling his rise, and now they were all part of his fall. Bulger's legacy would never be one of redemption, it would always be a reminder of how easily power could be misused, how loyalty could be twisted, and how justice could be delayed. The man who had once ruled the streets of Boston was now just another prisoner, his story a cautionary tale of ambition, betrayal, and the corrupting influence of power. Whitey Bulger's story didn't end with his arrest in 2011, it took on a new, more chilling chapter in the years that followed, one marked by both grim justice and lingering questions. The days of his rule in the streets of Boston, his empire built on a bedrock of fear, manipulation, and murder, were over. Yet, even in prison, the remnants of his influence persisted. The complex figure that he was, the man who had been a ruthless gangster, a feared informant, and a shadow in the lives of so many, seemed to defy simple categorization. But prison life for someone like Whitey Bulger, someone who had lived by his wits and who had outlasted so many in his violent underworld, would hardly be a quiet affair. When Bulger was convicted and sent to prison, the life he had known for decades came to an abrupt halt. He had been the one pulling the strings, the one who had called the shots, but in the sterile, confining world of the federal penitentiary, his influence was all but non-existent. The walls that had once protected him, from his criminal empire to his high-powered FBI connections, had now become the boundaries of his new existence. Yet even in this new and restrictive environment, Bulger didn't simply fade into obscurity. He had lived for decades with the belief that he was untouchable, a belief that was impossible to shake even behind bars. In prison, Bulger's life was dictated not by the same rules he had followed in the streets, but by a new set of unspoken codes, codes of power, respect, and survival. Even in the most secure federal facilities, the culture of violence and power was alive, and Whitey Bulger quickly learned that, in this new world, he was far from the top. For a man who had ruled Boston's criminal world for so long, the sudden shift from being in control to being vulnerable was not just humbling, it was an affront to everything he had stood for. Prison wasn't just a place where he could lie low, it was a constant reminder that no matter how powerful or feared a person might be, they were all ultimately equal behind bars. But the new chapter of Bulger's life behind bars was far from peaceful. The reputation he had built during his reign in Boston preceded him, and it wasn't long before it started to stir trouble within the prison walls. Bulger was placed into the general population of a high-security prison, where the inmates were not ordinary criminals, but often the most dangerous and violent individuals in the country. Inmates in these facilities are often locked in a social hierarchy, with various factions vying for power and influence. Whitey Bulger, once the undisputed king of his domain, now found himself amongst men who had their own violent histories, men who had their own scores to settle. Within the prison system, the name Whitey Bulger carried a certain weight, a recognition that could work both for and against him. Many prisoners knew of him, had heard of him, and some had even crossed paths with him during his reign in the streets. The fact that Bulger had been an FBI informant, the very thing that had helped protect him for years in the outside world, was a dangerous double-edged sword. In the eyes of many inmates, that made him not just a criminal, but a traitor. An informant in the prison world was among the lowest of the low, a target for other inmates who saw betrayal as the ultimate sin. Bulger, the once feared and untouchable mob boss, was now viewed by some as nothing more than a snitch, an easy target for anyone looking to make a name for themselves. This change in his status in the criminal underworld, from a feared figure to a marked man, soon led to tension within the prison. It was inevitable that, in a system that thrived on dominance and retribution, Bulger would be tested. It wasn't long before his own survival became a matter of protecting his reputation, one that had been carefully cultivated for decades. Whitey Bulger was no stranger to violence, but the violence he faced now was a far cry from the controlled, calculated eliminations of rivals in Boston. In prison, violence was a currency, and everyone knew that to survive, you had to either defend yourself or risk being eaten alive. Bulger, despite his age and the years of evading justice, had lived a life of ruthless aggression. But in this new world, those very traits became a disadvantage. As time passed, it became clear that Bulger's infamous reputation was both a blessing and a curse. Though many inmates were aware of the power he once held, the fact that he was an informant, a rat in the eyes of many, made him a marked man. No one wanted to be associated with him, and the old alliances and power structures he once commanded had long since evaporated. Instead, Bulger was now viewed with suspicion and distrust, not just by fellow prisoners but by the very people who ran the prison system. For a man who had spent his entire life manipulating others, the rules had changed in a way that even he couldn't control. The reality of his new life behind bars was one of isolation, fear, and vulnerability. Prison, for Whitey Bulger, became a battleground not just for survival, but for maintaining his sense of identity. He was no longer the kingpin who called the shots from the shadows. He was just another prisoner, living in a world where his past power meant very little. But even in this environment, Bulger was able to make his presence felt. He wasn't the same man who had commanded loyalty and fear in the streets, but he was still Whitey Bulger, still a survivor. He attempted to build new alliances, to navigate the precarious social dynamics of the prison population. But the fact that he had been a rat in the eyes of so many made any such attempts a perilous venture. The years in prison did little to quell Bulger's desire for control. He was always scheming, always calculating his next move, always looking for a way to reassert his influence. But the rules of this new world didn't play into his hands the way they had on the streets. It wasn't long before those who had been watching him closely realized that Bulger's days of manipulation were limited. He had few friends left, and his ability to work the system was significantly diminished. In the world of the federal penitentiary, everyone was just trying to survive, and there were few people willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. His only option was to lie low, or so he thought. By 2018, after years of shifting from one high-security prison to another, Whitey Bulger was transferred to the United States Penitentiary Hazleton, a notorious federal prison located in West Virginia. This would be the final stop in his long journey through the prison system. It was at Hazleton that Bulger's reign of survival would come to a bloody end. On the night of October 30, 2018, Whitey Bulger was found dead in his cell, the victim of an apparent beating. The circumstances of his death were as mysterious as much of his life had been. Bulger had been moved to Hazleton just days before his death, and it seemed that his very presence there had drawn the attention of other inmates. As the details of his death began to emerge, it was clear that Bulger had become a target. He had been placed in a general population unit with dangerous criminals, many of whom had their own scores to settle. The fact that Bulger had been an informant only added fuel to the fire. His reputation as a traitor in the eyes of many of the other inmates meant that he was walking a fine line between survival and certain death. Though his death was swift, it was not unexpected. Bulger, like so many others before him, had met his end at the hands of those he had crossed in life. His brutal and violent rise to power had come full circle. He had been a predator in the criminal world, but in the end, he had become the prey. His death, just days after arriving at Hazleton, raised questions about the extent of the prison's responsibility for his safety, and it cast a long, dark shadow over the final chapter of his life. Whether it was a well-executed hit by rival criminals, a personal vendetta, or a failure of prison security, Whitey Bulger's death marked the tragic, violent end of a life that had been filled with bloodshed and deceit. In the end, Whitey Bulger's death, much like his life, was a culmination of his actions and the choices he had made. It was a brutal reminder that in the world of crime, power is fleeting, and those who live by violence often die by it. His life had been one of survival, of betrayal, and manipulation, traits that had served him well in the streets of Boston but had ultimately led him down a path of destruction. And so, when he was found dead in that cell, it was not just the end of Whitey Bulger, it was the final consequence of a life lived in the shadows, a life that had touched the lives of countless others, leaving a legacy that was as much about the lives he destroyed as the empire he had built. Whitey Bulger's death, though swift, marked the end of a complex and troubling life, a life that had spanned decades of manipulation, power, and betrayal. The notorious mobster's story was one that not only defined an era of organized crime in Boston but also became a symbol of the intersection between crime and corruption, loyalty and treachery, power and downfall. As news of his death spread, many were left reflecting on the legacy of a man whose life had been built on fear, intimidation, and deceit. But just as his life had been filled with layers of contradictions, so too was his death, a death that seemed, in many ways, like a final, cruel punctuation mark on a story that had already stretched far beyond what anyone could have expected. Bulger's final days were marked by increasing tension and paranoia, but even in the aftermath of his capture and incarceration, there was a sense that the monster he had created would never truly leave the world he had dominated for so long. His name continued to carry weight, both in the world of criminality and in the minds of those who had been affected by his empire. For the families of his victims, Bulger's death did not provide a sense of closure. Instead, it left lingering questions, unresolved feelings, and a complex mixture of emotions. Had justice truly been served? Had the families of those he had murdered been given the satisfaction of knowing that the man responsible for their loved ones' deaths had finally been punished, or had they been denied that final, human reckoning? In the end, Whitey Bulger's death did not erase the reality of his crimes. While his presence in the streets of Boston had long been erased by law enforcement, his death brought the story of his life back into sharp focus. The investigation into his death would go on to cast further shadows over his legacy. Reports began to emerge about the circumstances of his final moments, and as prison officials revealed more details about his death, a clear picture of the violence that marked his final days began to emerge. The details surrounding his death revealed the truth of how even in prison, Bulger remained a target, both for his past as a ruthless gangster and for his betrayal as an informant. His reputation had followed him behind bars, and it had left a trail of enemies in his wake. The idea that Bulger could be killed so quickly after being transferred to a high-security prison raised many questions. Was his death a calculated act of revenge by a fellow inmate, or was it simply a matter of prison violence running its usual course? Some speculated that the men who carried out the murder saw Bulger as an easy mark, an old man who had once been feared but who, in their eyes, was now weak and vulnerable. Others believed that it was the culmination of years of resentment toward him as a man who had lived by betrayal, who had sold out his fellow criminals, and who had used the very system meant to imprison him to further his own interests. Regardless of the motive, Bulger's death was the final blow in a life that had been defined by violence. The questions surrounding Bulger's murder continued to fuel the conversation long after the news of his death had spread. Prison officials were left scrambling to explain how the notorious figure could have been killed on their watch, in a high-security facility designed to keep such violent criminals from reaching the general population. Some argued that Bulger's death was inevitable given the amount of animosity toward him, others claimed that the prison had failed to provide him with the protection he needed, given the notorious reputation that preceded him. Prison reformers, meanwhile, pointed to his murder as an example of the systemic failure that allowed criminals like Bulger to thrive for so long and then end up in an environment where their crimes could continue, even after they had been locked away. But for the families of Whitey Bulger's victims, the story of his death was not just a tale of retribution. The families had waited decades to see him brought to justice for the murders he had committed, murders that were often hidden behind a veil of silence, manipulation, and intimidation. Many had hoped for a day when Bulger would be made to answer for his crimes in court, where the victims' families could finally speak their truths and have them heard by the world. The trial, which had taken place in 2013, had been a moment of reckoning for some, but Bulger's death added another layer of complexity to the process of closure. For many of the families, his death seemed almost anticlimactic, one final act of violence in a life that had been filled with them. Despite the fact that Bulger was behind bars at the time of his death, the damage his criminal empire had caused still rippled through the lives of countless people. His legacy as a mob boss, as a killer who had built his empire on a foundation of fear and betrayal, was far from over. While his life had been brought to a violent conclusion, the story of what he had done to Boston, to the people who had been caught in his web, remained unfinished. Bulger had, for years, evaded the consequences of his actions, first through manipulation of the criminal underworld, and later through his dealings with the FBI. His death did not change the fact that many of the families of his victims would never see justice in the way they had hoped. For them, the final chapter was never written, it remained an open wound, a reminder of the lives that had been lost and the devastation Bulger had caused. As the dust settled around his death, the media continued to report on the aftermath, interviewing former associates and family members who had known Bulger. Some still spoke of him in awe, as though his criminal genius had been something to be respected, even admired. Others, however, were quick to point out the darkness that had followed him throughout his life, reminding the public that, despite his charisma and ability to control people, he was ultimately a man who had committed heinous acts without remorse. The duality of Whitey Bulger, the violent, calculating gangster who had commanded respect in the streets, and the FBI informant who had betrayed those closest to him, remained a central theme in any conversation about his legacy. In death, Whitey Bulger's myth only grew. He became the stuff of legend, a figure whose name would be forever etched in the annals of organized crime, even if it was now synonymous with betrayal and violence. But for many, the story of Whitey Bulger was one that spoke to the dark heart of human nature, the lengths to which someone would go to maintain power, to survive, and to manipulate those around them. His story was one of ambition, betrayal, and death, a tragic reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, could ever truly escape the consequences of their actions. The investigation into his death eventually revealed more about the circumstances, but for those who had been close to him, the reality was more bitter than any report could capture. For the families who had been affected by Bulger's actions, the pain was not lessened by his death, in fact, it was only heightened. The tragedy of his life was not that he was caught or that he was imprisoned, it was that so many lives had been destroyed in the pursuit of his empire. Whitey Bulger had lived and died by the very forces he had once controlled, and in the end, that was his true legacy. A man who had once held the city of Boston in his grip had died alone, in a prison cell, at the hands of the very people he had once ruled over in the shadows. In the end, Whitey Bulger's life and death served as a testament to the complexities of power and betrayal, the fragility of human ambition, and the relentless nature of justice. His story, dark and twisted as it was, would never truly be over, for it would continue to shape the conversation about crime, punishment, and corruption for generations to come. Whitey Bulger's legacy, steeped in violence, betrayal, and manipulation, extends far beyond the criminal empire he once ruled in Boston. His story isn't just the tale of a mobster's rise to power, but the painful truths of a system that allowed him to thrive for decades. For those who lived through the era of his dominance, Whitey wasn't just a gangster, he was a symbol of fear, an almost mythological figure whose reach extended into every corner of the city. And yet, beneath that shadow of terror was a man who managed to escape justice time and time again, not just through brute force, but through the insidious nature of his relationship with the FBI. This paradox, Bulger as both a ruthless criminal and a protected informant, made him a character of both fascination and revulsion, a figure whose story would never truly be contained, even after his death. The relationship between Bulger and the FBI was, in many ways, the linchpin of his success. The criminal underworld, with all its chaos and violence, can only be understood when viewed in the context of how law enforcement interacts with it. Bulger's ability to navigate both sides of the law, serving as an informant to the FBI while simultaneously running his own empire of crime, was something almost unheard of in the world of organized crime. He wasn't just a mob boss, he was an FBI asset, and this dual identity gave him a degree of protection that few could have imagined. The FBI's failure to see him for what he truly was, a ruthless gangster who was manipulating them as much as they were trying to control him, became one of the greatest scandals in the history of American law enforcement. Bulger's work as an informant began in the 1970s when he started feeding the FBI information on the mafia, particularly the Patriarca crime family in New England. This was a time when the FBI, under pressure to make progress in fighting organized crime, began relying heavily on informants to infiltrate criminal organizations. Bulger was a perfect candidate. He had deep roots in the Boston underworld, and his intelligence, mixed with his brutal nature, made him both an invaluable asset and a dangerous liability. But while he was giving the FBI critical information about the mafia, he was simultaneously working his way up the ranks of the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish-American crime group that would eventually rival the mafia itself. Bulger's rise through the ranks was characterized by the same tactics that defined his life outside of law enforcement: violence, intimidation, and strategic betrayal. By the late 1970s, he was the de facto leader of the Winter Hill Gang, a position that allowed him to control not only the streets of Boston but also its very political and law enforcement institutions. His role as an informant, meant to protect him from prosecution, allowed him to eliminate any rivals who could stand in his way. The FBI's failure to see the danger in allowing a man like Bulger to operate with such freedom was a blind spot that would haunt them for years. What made Bulger's relationship with the FBI so toxic was not just the fact that he was both a criminal and an informant, it was the sheer level of corruption that existed between them. He used the FBI as a shield, and in turn, the FBI used him to take down the mafia, while turning a blind eye to his own criminal activities. His handler, John Connolly, was one of the most pivotal figures in this partnership. Connolly, an FBI agent, had known Bulger from their shared roots in Boston and had become one of his most loyal protectors. Their bond was one of mutual benefit. Bulger provided information on the mafia, and Connolly ensured that Bulger stayed out of prison. This dynamic led to a symbiotic relationship in which the line between law enforcement and organized crime was blurred beyond recognition. Bulger wasn't just a criminal who was evading the law, he was a man who had manipulated the very system meant to take him down. While he was informing on the mafia, he was simultaneously using his inside knowledge of law enforcement to keep the FBI off his trail. As a result, he became untouchable, operating with a degree of impunity that few in the world of organized crime ever achieved. His ability to remain one step ahead of the law, while continuing to run his criminal operations with ruthless efficiency, was a testament to his cunning and strategic brilliance. But it was also a damning indictment of the systemic failures that allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. In the early 1990s, the FBI's relationship with Bulger began to unravel. As Bulger's influence continued to grow, so did his paranoia. He was no longer just a small-time informant who had been given a free pass, he was a man who had built an empire on lies and manipulation, and he feared that his allies, both inside and outside of the FBI, would eventually turn on him. Bulger's growing paranoia would lead him to take increasingly extreme measures to eliminate anyone who might threaten his power. He had already murdered those who had crossed him in his personal life, now, he turned his focus to those who might expose his criminal dealings. By the time Bulger disappeared in 1994, the relationship between him and the FBI had completely broken down. Bulger had outlived his usefulness to the agency, and his criminal empire had grown too large for them to ignore. But by then, the damage was done. The question on everyone's mind was not just how Bulger had managed to escape for so long, but how he had been able to manipulate the FBI for decades. The public's trust in law enforcement had been shattered, and the consequences of the FBI's failure to bring Bulger to justice were felt far beyond the Boston area. Bulger had used the FBI as his own personal weapon, and it had allowed him to stay at the top of the criminal world for years. For the families of Bulger's victims, the discovery that the FBI had played a role in his rise to power was a bitter blow. Many of the people he had killed, rivals, witnesses, and those who had crossed him, had never received justice, not because the FBI couldn't catch him, but because the agency had been complicit in allowing him to continue his reign of terror. The FBI's role in this failure would remain one of the most contentious aspects of Bulger's legacy. Even after his disappearance, the mystery of Whitey Bulger continued to haunt the city of Boston. The man who had evaded capture for so many years became a ghost, a figure whose legend only grew in the absence of concrete answers. In 2011, the FBI finally tracked Bulger down in Santa Monica, California, where he had been living under an assumed name. His arrest, after 16 years on the run, felt like a moment of reckoning for a city that had been living with the fear and uncertainty that Bulger had instilled in it. His capture was a victory for law enforcement, but it was a hollow one, a reminder of how long Bulger had been allowed to operate unchecked. But Bulger's story didn't end there. His trial was a spectacle, a long-awaited reckoning for the man who had evaded justice for so long. It revealed the full extent of his criminal activities, including the murders he had committed and the web of corruption that had protected him for years. Yet even as he stood trial, it became clear that Bulger still didn't fully grasp the enormity of his actions. He was not just a criminal, he was a man who had betrayed everyone around him, a man who had used every system meant to bring criminals to justice for his own gain. Whitey Bulger's death in 2018 did not mark the end of his story, it only served to fuel the mythology that surrounded him. Even in death, he remained a figure of fascination, a symbol of everything that was corrupt and broken in the world of organized crime. His life, and the life of the criminal empire he built, would continue to serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder that in the world of crime, power is fleeting, loyalty is fragile, and justice, when it is finally served, often comes too late. Bulger's story is not just a tale of a gangster's rise and fall, it is the story of the system that failed to stop him, the people who turned a blind eye, and the victims who were left in his wake. It is a story of betrayal, corruption, and the insidious ways in which crime can become part of the very fabric of society. Whitey Bulger's life was a canvas painted in the hues of fear, betrayal, and power, each stroke a reminder of the violence he inflicted on those around him, and the intricate web of manipulation he wove with his own hands. His legacy, woven into the very fabric of Boston's underworld, left an indelible mark on the city. The story of Whitey Bulger is not just the rise and fall of a gangster, it is the haunting tale of how unchecked power, loyalty to self overall, and betrayal can define a life, and in the process, destroy countless others. His life was defined by his ability to move through the world with a chilling detachment, always planning, always calculating, never allowing his own moral compass to steer him in the direction of right. And while many would see him as a villain, a figure of terror, others viewed him as a necessary evil, a force that kept order in a world where law and justice were often seen as optional. The sense of inevitability that surrounded Bulger's rise to power was one felt by everyone who lived in Boston during the 1980s and 1990s. From a young age, Bulger seemed destined to rule, not just the streets, but the people. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of South Boston, his early years were marked by poverty, violence, and a struggle for survival. But there was something in him that was different from the other boys, something that made him rise above the rest. He had an uncanny ability to charm, to manipulate, to get people to trust him, only to betray that trust when it served his interests. This ruthless cunning was part of the reason he was able to gain power so quickly within the Winter Hill Gang, a group that operated with violence but was also bound by a strict code of conduct. In many ways, Bulger was not just a product of his environment, he was a man who mastered it, bending it to his will, until he became a force in his own right. Bulger's story is one of paradoxes. He was both feared and revered, despised yet respected. His name became synonymous with violence, but he also cultivated an image of a protector, a man who looked after the interests of his neighborhood and kept the criminals in check. He was the Robin Hood of South Boston for some, even if the people he protected were often other criminals, and the goods he redistributed were drugs, extortion payments, and stolen goods. He wasn't just a part of the criminal fabric, he was the weaver, the one who tied everything together with ruthless efficiency. But at the heart of his success was his ability to straddle the line between criminal and informant, creating a web so intricate that even the FBI, for years, couldn't see the full scope of his influence. This dual identity, criminal and informant, was perhaps the most significant aspect of Bulger's life. It was a dichotomy that played out with terrifying precision. As an informant, he provided the FBI with information about his competitors in the mafia, but he also used his position to eliminate rivals who stood in his way. He would feed the FBI information about his enemies, all the while using that same information to further his own criminal enterprises. The FBI, desperate to take down the Italian mafia, never fully realized they were being played by the very man they thought they were using. They believed they had found a golden informant who could help them dismantle the mafia, but in reality, they had given Bulger the tools he needed to eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to his empire. And in return, Bulger remained untouchable, his criminal empire growing in strength while his FBI handlers turned a blind eye to the chaos he left in his wake. The ties between Bulger and the FBI would come back to haunt them in the years to come, but in the moment, those ties were a lifeline for a man who had outwitted so many before. He was the master of deception, the puppet master pulling the strings of both the criminal world and the very institution tasked with keeping that world in check. His relationship with the FBI was not just a betrayal of the agency but also a betrayal of everyone who had trusted him. Bulger's manipulation of the FBI allowed him to act with impunity, knowing that even the most damning evidence against him would be ignored or suppressed. He lived above the law, above the consequences that awaited so many others who would have been held accountable for the same crimes. But as the years passed, and the FBI grew more desperate to take down the mafia, Bulger began to feel the heat closing in on him. His power, once unchecked, started to show signs of cracking. The very system he had once manipulated began to turn against him. His handlers at the FBI were no longer as protective, and the stakes grew higher. It wasn't just about control anymore, it was about survival. Bulger's paranoia grew, and his need to eliminate any threat became more extreme. The men he had trusted, the allies he had built, all became potential threats in his eyes. Bulger turned on everyone, seeing betrayal lurking around every corner, even among those who had once been his closest confidants. His world, once solid and impenetrable, began to fracture, and it was then, in 1994, that he disappeared, vanishing into the ether like a ghost, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and broken promises. His disappearance would become the stuff of legend. For 16 years, Whitey Bulger became the most famous fugitive in America. Law enforcement agencies around the world hunted for him, but he remained elusive. The man who had evaded the law for decades was now the object of a nationwide manhunt, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. How could the FBI, who had worked with him for years, failed to catch him? How had a man who had once ruled the streets of Boston been allowed to simply slip away, untouched by justice? The years on the run were a time of reinvention for Bulger. He lived under the name Charlie Gasco, hiding out in plain sight with his girlfriend, Catherine Gregg. He moved from one hiding spot to another, changing locations, blending into new communities, always careful not to draw attention to himself. Bulger's ability to stay hidden, even as the authorities closed in on him, was a testament to his survival instincts and the depth of his cunning. He was no longer the powerful figure who had once walked the streets of Boston with an air of invincibility. He was now a man on the run, constantly looking over his shoulder, aware that his empire had crumbled, and that his past had finally caught up to him. But even in exile, Whitey Bulger remained a symbol of the darkness that had defined him. His story was not just one of a gangster's rise and fall, it was a story of a system that had failed the very people it was supposed to protect. His life, and the years spent on the run, were a constant reminder of the flaws in the criminal justice system and the lengths to which a man would go to escape the consequences of his actions. Bulger's legacy is not just about the crimes he committed or the lives he ruined, it's about the system that allowed him to thrive for so long. His story is one of power, paranoia, betrayal, and survival. It's the story of a man who lived and died by his own rules, and who ultimately paid the price for the empire he built on lies. When Whitey Bulger was finally captured in 2011, the world seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The man who had haunted the streets of Boston for so many years was finally in custody. His capture brought an end to one chapter of his story, but it also reopened old wounds for the families of his victims, who had waited decades for this moment. Bulger's trial, which followed his capture, was a spectacle that captivated the nation. The trial exposed the full extent of his crimes, the murders, the extortion, the racketeering, and the truth about his role as an informant. For the families of his victims, the trial was a long-awaited reckoning, but it was also a painful reminder of the lives that had been lost, and the years that had been wasted while Bulger had been allowed to operate with impunity. Bulger's death in 2018, while behind bars, was a tragic end to a long and tumultuous life. Some saw it as a final act of justice, a man who had evaded punishment for so long finally facing the consequences of his actions. Others, however, viewed it as a reminder of the complexity of Bulger's life, of how a man who had spent so much of his time manipulating others had ultimately become a victim of his own choices. Bulger's death, like his life, was filled with contradiction. It was a death that was as violent and brutal as the crimes he had committed, but it was also a death that symbolized the twisted nature of the criminal world he had inhabited. In the end, Whitey Bulger's story will always be one of contradictions, a man who was both a monster and a victim, a criminal and an informant, a leader and a betrayer. His legacy, built on power, fear, and manipulation, will never fade from the public consciousness, nor will the questions surrounding his rise, his crimes, and his ultimate fall. Bulger's life was one of self-preservation at any cost, and his death marked the end of a dark era in Boston's history. Yet, even in death, Whitey Bulger's name will forever be tied to the shadows he left behind. His legacy is one of the fragility of power, the destructive nature of ambition, and the relentless pursuit of survival, no matter the cost. Whitey Bulger's grip on Boston was not just the result of his brutality and fear tactics, it was the product of a calculated web of loyalty, manipulation, and charm that he used to control not just his criminal associates, but those in positions of power. His reign stretched over decades, and in that time, Bulger had woven himself into the very fabric of the city, making him both a figure of awe and a symbol of the dark side of the American dream. While the details of his crimes and betrayals are well known, it is the psychological complexity behind his ability to manipulate the system that truly reveals the depth of his depravity. Bulger was more than just a gangster, he was a master manipulator, a man who knew how to bend situations to his advantage and outwit those who sought to stop him. Bulger's ability to manipulate was not limited to his criminal empire, he extended it into the realm of politics and law enforcement, building relationships with key figures in both. His ties with the FBI were perhaps the most notorious and far-reaching aspect of his career. As an informant for the agency, Bulger became not only an untouchable figure in the criminal world but a well-protected one. For decades, he was able to operate with relative impunity, using the FBI as a shield while maintaining control over his criminal empire. Bulger knew that, in a system where loyalty was as much about survival as it was about respect, he could count on his informant status to provide him with the protection he needed to eliminate rivals, expand his influence, and stay out of prison. But Bulger's rise was not simply a matter of being a shrewd businessman or a skilled manipulator. He understood the intricacies of power, both in the criminal world and beyond it. He knew that real power didn't just come from the ability to intimidate, it came from the ability to control information, to keep people off balance, and to keep them guessing. His criminal empire was built on secrecy and fear, but it was also sustained by a network of informants, bribed officials, and willing allies. Through these means, he was able to maintain a level of control that few could even imagine. Bulger had an almost uncanny ability to get people to trust him, to make them believe that they were on the same side, when in reality, he was always playing a game of his own. One of Bulger's greatest strengths was his ability to create a sense of loyalty and trust among his associates, even as he manipulated them. He had a way of making people feel that they owed him something, that their successes were tied to his protection and guidance. For many, this bond seemed unbreakable. But beneath the surface of this loyalty was an ever-present undercurrent of fear. Bulger didn't just demand respect, he instilled terror in those around him, ensuring that they would always toe the line. His very presence in a room could make the air thick with unease, a reminder that crossing him would come at a steep price. Many of those who worked with him did so because they feared the alternative, not because they truly admired him. But in the world of organized crime, fear was just as valuable as loyalty. Bulger's interactions with law enforcement were equally complex. For years, he was able to maintain a close relationship with the FBI, using them to shield himself from prosecution while feeding them information on his competitors. His relationship with his primary FBI handler, John Connolly, was particularly significant. Connolly, a man from the same neighborhood as Bulger, became one of his most trusted allies in the FBI. The two men worked together for years, with Connolly feeding Bulger information about the mafia and other criminal investigations, while Bulger provided the FBI with information about the mafia's operations. This mutual relationship of convenience was one that served both parties for a time, but it ultimately came at a great cost to justice. The extent to which Bulger manipulated Connolly and other law enforcement figures is staggering. He was able to remain in the shadows of the law, a phantom who seemed to slip through the cracks time and time again. Bulger knew exactly what buttons to press, what deals to strike, and when to use his status as an informant to keep the authorities at bay. His ability to exploit the system for his own benefit is a testament to the corruption that can arise when law enforcement and criminals become too entwined. And while the FBI was certainly complicit in his rise, it was also clear that Bulger was a master at playing the game, always keeping one step ahead, always staying just outside the reach of the law. But for all his skill at manipulating the system, Bulger's fall was inevitable. The very system he had exploited for so long eventually turned against him. As his power and influence grew, so did the number of people who saw through his web of lies. The more people he crossed, the more enemies he made, and the greater the risk of his empire crumbling. The signs of his downfall were there for anyone who cared to look. Bulger's increasing paranoia made him more erratic, more prone to violence, and more willing to betray even those closest to him. His ability to trust anyone, even those who had been loyal to him for years, diminished as he began to fear that his empire was slipping away. It was this paranoia that would ultimately lead to his downfall, but it would take years for the consequences of his actions to catch up with him. Bulger's disappearance in 1994 was a reflection of the fear that had begun to consume him. The man who had once ruled Boston's criminal underworld with a mixture of charm and terror had gone into hiding, seemingly out of fear that those he had wronged, whether they were criminals or law enforcement officials, would come after him. His decision to disappear was a calculated one, driven by the belief that the only way to survive was to vanish from the face of the earth. It was during these years on the run that Bulger's mythos grew, he became the stuff of legend, a ghost whose absence seemed to heighten his mystique. For 16 years, he evaded the law, living in plain sight under the alias of Charlie Gasco, blending in with ordinary people while staying off the radar of law enforcement. His ability to remain hidden for so long only added to the enigma of his character. The eventual capture of Whitey Bulger in 2011 was a moment of justice, but it was also a moment that underscored the failures of the systems that had allowed him to flourish for so long. His arrest, after more than a decade of evading capture, was a victory for law enforcement, but it also raised difficult questions about how he had managed to escape justice for so many years. Bulger had used every tool at his disposal to evade capture, and it wasn't until a massive manhunt, involving multiple agencies and the public, that he was finally located in Santa Monica, California. His capture was a major triumph for the FBI, but it was also a reflection of how far-reaching and insidious Bulger's network of influence had been. The trial that followed Bulger's capture was a spectacle that captivated the nation. It exposed the full extent of his criminal activities, revealing the murders, extortion, drug trafficking, and corruption that had defined his reign over Boston. The trial also revealed the depth of his betrayal, his manipulation of the FBI, his use of the agency as a tool to further his criminal enterprises, and his ruthless treatment of anyone who crossed him. Bulger's ability to lie, to twist the truth, and to manipulate those around him was on full display throughout the proceedings. But for all the attention the trial garnered, there was a sense that it was too little, too late. The years of violence, of manipulation, of betrayal, had already taken their toll. For the families of Bulger's victims, the trial was a long-awaited moment of reckoning, but it was also a reminder of the years they had lost, of the lives that had been taken, and of the system that had failed to bring Bulger to justice when it mattered most. Bulger's death in 2018, while behind bars, marked the final chapter of a life that had been defined by violence, manipulation, and betrayal. But even in death, Whitey Bulger's name remained a symbol of the darkness that can exist within the criminal world, and the systems that enable it. His life, and the web of deceit he wove, will always be a part of Boston's history, a reminder of how easily power can be abused, how loyalty can be corrupted, and how justice can be delayed by the very forces that are supposed to uphold it. Bulger's story, for all its complexity, is a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the fragility of trust, and the inevitability of retribution. No matter how clever, no matter how powerful, no one escapes the consequences of their actions forever. Whitey Bulger's reign may have come to an end, but his legacy of fear, manipulation, and betrayal will never be forgotten. Whitey Bulger's story is not merely one of crime and retribution, it is a narrative about power, betrayal, and the intoxicating nature of fear. He was a man who walked the tightrope between law and lawlessness, knowing full well that the balance could only hold for so long before it would all come crashing down. And as much as Bulger was the architect of his own rise and fall, there was something about the environment that nurtured him, an undercurrent of corruption and disregard for justice, that allowed him to thrive. This was not just the tale of one man's ascent through the criminal world, it was a story of how a broken system, plagued with its own flaws, enabled a man like Bulger to dominate for decades. It is a story of institutional failure, of a system so obsessed with the capture of the mafia that it turned a blind eye to the monster sitting at its own table. When Bulger first came into contact with the FBI in the late 1970s, he was already a fixture in Boston's criminal underworld. He had risen to prominence through his involvement in the Winter Hill Gang, an Irish-American crime group that was known for its brutal enforcement of rules and its ability to maintain a relatively low profile in the shadow of the Italian mafia. But what made Bulger different from others in his position was his ability to move seamlessly between worlds. He was as much a part of the mafia as he was an informant feeding intelligence to the FBI. This was a relationship that would define much of Bulger's career, allowing him to navigate the complexities of law enforcement, criminal enterprises, and personal survival with unparalleled skill. At the heart of Bulger's story is his ability to manipulate those around him, not just through fear and violence, but through the relationships he cultivated. He had an uncanny ability to make people feel indebted to him, whether they were fellow criminals or law enforcement officers. He was always several steps ahead, crafting a web of loyalty and intimidation that made it difficult for anyone to truly escape his influence. For the FBI, he became an invaluable asset, feeding them critical intelligence about rival gangs, particularly the mafia. In exchange, Bulger received protection from prosecution, and this arrangement, as corrupt as it was, allowed him to run his operations with a sense of impunity that most criminals could only dream of. This was the paradox that defined Whitey Bulger's life. While he was working as an informant for the FBI, he was also using that same information to eliminate his rivals, maintain control of his territory, and build his criminal empire. This dual role of informant and criminal boss gave him a power that few could even imagine. His status as an FBI asset protected him from the very forces that were supposed to bring him down. The more he fed the FBI information, the more untouchable he became. And the more untouchable he became, the more ruthless he was in his pursuit of power. But it wasn't just his relationship with the FBI that allowed Bulger to operate unchecked. He also built a network of loyal allies, both inside and outside the criminal world. These relationships were as vital to his success as his connection to the FBI. Bulger knew that in order to maintain power, he had to control every level of the game, from the streets to the boardrooms, from the backrooms of corrupt politicians to the high offices of law enforcement. He manipulated the media, played the political system, and created a vast network of informants who worked for him, whether out of fear or loyalty. Each time he removed a threat, whether by intimidation or murder, it only served to reinforce the perception of his invincibility. The way Bulger moved through the world was masterful in its subtlety. He knew how to blend into the background, how to operate in the shadows, and how to gain the trust of those who could help him, and eliminate those who stood in his way. His charisma was disarming, and it often worked in his favor. He could walk into a room filled with powerful men and have them eating out of his hand. But while they thought they were in control, he was always playing his own game, his own version of chess. Every relationship, every handshake, every deal he made was calculated for his benefit. He didn't just thrive on fear, he thrived on the trust he earned from those around him, even as he worked to deceive them. As Bulger's influence continued to grow, so did the tension within the city. Those who had once been allies began to turn on each other, knowing that in the world of organized crime, survival meant keeping one step ahead. But Bulger, with his mastery of manipulation, was always 2 steps ahead. He knew that trust was a commodity that could be bought and sold, and for him, the only loyalty that mattered was the loyalty that came from fear. He surrounded himself with men who were either too afraid to cross him or too loyal to ever question his decisions. And when the time came, when his position was threatened, Bulger didn't hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in his way. His criminal empire continued to expand, and with it, the paranoia that consumed him. The more power he gained, the more he feared losing it. He trusted fewer and fewer people, and the people he did trust were those who had proven their loyalty through violence and silence. It was this growing paranoia that ultimately led to Bulger's downfall. As his power and influence grew, so did his sense of vulnerability. He began to see threats where there were none, and in doing so, he became increasingly erratic. His once calm demeanor gave way to fits of rage and irrational decisions. Bulger, the man who had once been the undisputed king of Boston's criminal world, began to unravel from the inside. In the early 1990s, Bulger's reign started to fracture. The once untouchable criminal mastermind became more paranoid, more violent, and more unpredictable. His relationships with law enforcement, once his greatest asset, began to deteriorate. The very system that had allowed him to thrive began to turn on him, as his actions started to catch up with him. Bulger's status as an informant was exposed, and the FBI could no longer turn a blind eye to the fact that he had been running a criminal empire under their noses. But by the time the truth began to emerge, it was already too late to undo the damage. In 1994, after a series of escalating tensions and an increasing sense of vulnerability, Bulger vanished without a trace. His disappearance marked the beginning of the most famous manhunt in American history. For 16 years, Whitey Bulger was a ghost, a figure whose name became synonymous with the term fugitive. His absence only fueled the myth of his power. He had outwitted the FBI for years, and now, he had disappeared into the ether, leaving behind a trail of blood and unanswered questions. The FBI's failure to capture him was a reminder of just how deeply ingrained he had become in the system, a system that had enabled him to thrive for so long. For years, Bulger's name was spoken in hushed tones, his face a constant presence on the FBI's most wanted list. He became a symbol of corruption, of the deep-rooted failure within law enforcement to stop him. And yet, despite the years of hunting, despite the millions of dollars spent trying to bring him to justice, Bulger remained elusive. It wasn't until 2011, after years of investigations, that the FBI finally tracked him down in Santa Monica, California, where he had been living under the alias, Charlie Gasco. Bulger's capture was a moment of triumph for the FBI, but it was also a reminder of how deep his influence had run, how deeply embedded he was in the fabric of not just the criminal world, but the very institutions meant to bring him down. Bulger's trial, which began shortly after his capture, was a spectacle. It revealed the full extent of his crimes, the murders, the extortion, the corruption, and the manipulation of the very systems that were meant to prevent such crimes. But for the families of his victims, the trial was not just a spectacle, it was a moment of reckoning. For decades, they had lived in the shadows of Bulger's empire, their loved ones murdered, their lives shattered by a man who had never been held accountable. Now, at last, they had a chance to confront him, to see him face justice for the lives he had taken. Even as Bulger stood trial, it was clear that he had not truly repented for his actions. He remained defiant, unrepentant, and seemingly uninterested in the suffering he had caused. His arrogance, his sense of invincibility, had not disappeared with his capture. But it was this very arrogance, this belief that he was above the law, that had led to his eventual downfall. In the end, Whitey Bulger's life was a story of unchecked ambition, of power that was built on fear and manipulation, and of a system that had failed to stop him for far too long. His story is a testament to the destructive nature of unchecked power and the lengths to which a man will go to escape the consequences of his actions. Whitey Bulger's story is a stark illustration of the immense power that one individual can wield over an entire city, and the depths of depravity one can sink to when that power is unchecked. For decades, Bulger's criminal empire operated under the radar of the law, while he cultivated an image of invincibility, manipulating both the streets and the law enforcement officials meant to take him down. He was a master of playing both sides, using his informant status with the FBI to protect himself while simultaneously building his influence through fear, betrayal, and violence. His capacity to manipulate people, organizations, and entire systems was what allowed him to thrive in a world where danger lurked around every corner. But even the most seemingly untouchable individuals can be brought down by the very system they seek to control. Bulger's downfall, when it came, was a testament to how corruption can only carry one so far before it inevitably consumes everything in its wake. As the boss of the Winter Hill Gang, Bulger carved out a ruthless empire within Boston's criminal underworld. The Winter Hill Gang had long been a thorn in the side of the Italian mafia, and Bulger's leadership transformed it into a powerful force. He had a unique ability to create loyalty, not through camaraderie but through fear and coercion. For Bulger, loyalty was a currency that could be bought and sold, a tool to be manipulated in his game of control. Those who served him were not mere underlings, they were pawns in a game that he meticulously orchestrated. He used violence to maintain discipline and made sure that any challenge to his authority was met with swift, brutal punishment. But the key to Bulger's long reign was his ability to weave his criminal operations into the very fabric of Boston's power structures. While many gangsters are seen as outsiders to the world of law enforcement and politics, Bulger had an innate understanding of how to use these institutions to his advantage. His ties with the FBI, particularly with Agent John Connolly, were central to his success. Connolly, who was originally tasked with infiltrating and taking down the mafia, instead became an accomplice to Bulger. They were from the same neighborhood in South Boston, and their relationship began as one of mutual respect, but it soon became one of complete corruption. Bulger knew that to stay at the top, he needed the FBI's protection, and Connolly was the perfect person to offer it. In exchange for information on his rivals, Bulger provided the FBI with intelligence on the mafia, making him an invaluable informant. But Bulger wasn't just feeding them information, he was feeding them half-truths and lies, always making sure to keep his own position secure while using the FBI as a shield to take down his enemies. For years, this arrangement worked in Bulger's favor. The FBI, desperate to take down the mafia, turned a blind eye to his activities, believing that the information Bulger provided about the mafia's operations justified overlooking his own criminal behavior. As the Winter Hill Gang grew more powerful, Bulger's influence over law enforcement grew as well. He understood that the FBI's focus on the mafia allowed him to operate in the shadows, free from scrutiny. But it wasn't just the FBI that he had under his control. Bulger's reach extended into local government, the police department, and the media. His ability to manipulate people at all levels of power ensured that his criminal empire remained safe from any real threat. But with great power comes great risk, and Bulger's increasing paranoia would eventually lead to his undoing. As his empire expanded, so did his list of enemies. Bulger had a unique ability to alienate those closest to him. It wasn't enough for him to just be the boss, he needed to be the undisputed king, and anyone who posed a threat to that rule had to be removed. Whether it was through murder, intimidation, or betrayal, Bulger ensured that no one crossed him without facing severe consequences. His cruelty became legendary, and his reputation for violence spread throughout the city. Those who worked for him knew that crossing him was a death sentence, and many lived in constant fear of the wrath that might come at any moment. But despite his power and the fear he instilled in others, Bulger's paranoia began to overtake his judgment. He began to see enemies everywhere, even among those who had once been his most loyal allies. His increasing need to eliminate any potential threat led to a series of violent outbursts that began to fracture his empire. Bulger's need for control was so absolute that even those who had helped him build his criminal empire found themselves on the receiving end of his wrath. Bulger trusted fewer and fewer people, and in doing so, he pushed away the very people who had helped him reach the top. The FBI, which had once been his shield, was beginning to turn its attention toward him. The investigation into the Winter Hill Gang became more intense as Bulger's name began to surface in connection with unsolved murders and illegal activities. He knew that his time was running out, and his paranoia reached its peak. The man who had once been invincible was now on the run, forced to disappear into the shadows he had once controlled so expertly. Bulger's disappearance in 1994 marked the end of an era. The man who had once ruled Boston's underworld like a king was now a fugitive. For 16 years, he evaded capture, becoming one of the most notorious criminals in America. His disappearance only added to the mystique surrounding him. The man who had manipulated the very systems meant to bring him down had become a ghost, a figure whose name was whispered in fear and awe. Law enforcement agencies across the country launched a massive manhunt, but Bulger was careful, meticulous, and always one step ahead. He lived under an assumed name, hiding in plain sight, but still operating in the shadows. Bulger's ability to evade capture was a testament to his intelligence, but it also underscored the deep flaws in the system that allowed him to disappear without a trace. It wasn't until 2011 that Bulger was finally captured, living in a modest apartment in Santa Monica, California. His capture was a triumph for the FBI, but it was also a reminder of how deeply entrenched he had become in the very system that had failed to stop him for so many years. By the time of his capture, Bulger's criminal empire was long gone, but the damage he had caused lingered. His trial exposed the full extent of his crimes, murders, extortion, drug trafficking, and his manipulation of the FBI. The trial also revealed the staggering extent to which Bulger had played the system, using his position as an informant to stay one step ahead of the law for decades. But it wasn't just his criminal activities that captivated the public during his trial, it was also the revelation of his relationship with the FBI. The truth about his dealings with Connolly and other agents raised serious questions about corruption within the Bureau. The FBI, which had once been so eager to take down the mafia, had instead been enabling one of the most notorious criminals in American history. The trial served as a painful reminder of how power, loyalty, and corruption can intertwine in the most unexpected ways. Bulger's capture and subsequent trial were seen by many as the final chapter in his story, but they were also a stark reminder of the costs of unchecked power. His life, marked by violence, manipulation, and betrayal, ended in a federal prison cell, far from the streets he once controlled. But even in death, Bulger's legacy lives on. He is remembered not just as a gangster, but as a symbol of how the lines between law and criminality can blur when power is at stake. His story is one of ambition, paranoia, and a relentless pursuit of control, and it serves as a reminder of the dangers of a system that allows such individuals to thrive for far too long. Whitey Bulger's name is synonymous with fear, manipulation, and betrayal, a man who navigated the labyrinth of crime and corruption with a ruthless precision that made him one of the most notorious figures in American history. But the true complexity of his character lies not just in the violence he inflicted or the empire he built, but in his ability to slip through the cracks of law enforcement, to dance between the lines of legality and criminality with the grace of someone who understood the system better than anyone. Bulger was not just a gangster, he was a product of the very system that was supposed to stop him, a man who bent the rules to fit his ambitions and used the law itself as a weapon to protect his interests. His story is one of a man who played both sides of the game expertly, hiding in plain sight for decades while maintaining a grip on Boston's underworld that few could even imagine. At the heart of Bulger's rise was his ability to exploit every relationship he had for personal gain. He didn't just use the FBI as a tool to protect himself from prosecution, he used them as a shield to tear down anyone who stood in his way. As an informant for the Bureau, Bulger gave them just enough information about his competitors, the mafia, to earn their trust, while keeping his own criminal activities hidden in plain sight. His relationship with the FBI was a masterclass in manipulation. He understood that in the world of organized crime, loyalty was a valuable currency, and he paid for that loyalty with the protection of the government. While he was feeding the FBI intel on the mafia, he was simultaneously expanding his own criminal empire, using that information to eliminate rivals and keep the law at bay. In his mind, the system wasn't something to work within, it was something to be manipulated, bent to his will. This symbiotic relationship between Bulger and the FBI worked in the beginning because it allowed both parties to get what they wanted. The FBI thought they were making headway against the mafia, while Bulger built his empire in the shadows. But as his influence grew, so did his sense of invincibility. Bulger wasn't content with being just another powerful figure in Boston's underworld. He wanted to be the undisputed king, and to achieve that, he needed complete control. This meant eliminating anyone who could threaten his position, whether that meant rivals from the mafia, competitors in the drug trade, or even those in his inner circle who had begun to question his leadership. Bulger's willingness to resort to extreme violence was a defining characteristic of his rule. His ruthless nature was not just about securing his empire, it was about ensuring that no one ever dared to challenge his authority. But what made Bulger even more dangerous was his ability to maintain an image of respectability while orchestrating a reign of terror behind closed doors. On the surface, he was just another businessman, someone who could blend into society with ease. But underneath, he was a man who lived by a set of rules defined by fear and intimidation. He was a master of disguise, both literally and figuratively. He knew how to play the game, how to work the media, how to present himself as a law-abiding citizen while hiding his criminal deeds behind a carefully constructed persona. This ability to compartmentalize his life, to play both sides of the law, allowed him to move freely, avoiding suspicion even as he expanded his criminal operations. For years, he remained one of the most wanted men in America, but to those who didn't know him, he was just another face in the crowd, someone who had built a life for himself without anyone suspecting the horrors he was capable of. It wasn't just law enforcement that Bulger manipulated, he also built a vast network of informants and loyal followers, each one playing their part in his criminal empire. Bulger was a master at knowing who to trust and who to manipulate. His ability to read people, to understand their motivations and weaknesses, was one of the key factors in his success. He surrounded himself with men who were either too afraid to betray him or too loyal to ever consider it. But loyalty, in Bulger's world, wasn't something that came naturally, it was something that had to be earned through violence and intimidation. Those who did not prove themselves were discarded, often brutally. Bulger made it clear that in his world, trust was a commodity that had to be bought and maintained through fear. His criminal associates knew that if they crossed him, the consequences would be severe. Bulger's very presence in a room could silence anyone who dared to question him, and those who remained loyal to him did so because they feared what might happen if they didn't. However, the deeper Bulger's empire grew, the more paranoid he became. For years, he was untouchable, but as time passed, he began to see threats everywhere. He became increasingly distrustful of everyone around him, even those who had been with him from the beginning. Bulger's fear of betrayal was ever present, and his violent tendencies grew even more erratic. He eliminated anyone he suspected of disloyalty, even when there was little evidence to justify such drastic action. This paranoia, which had once been a tool for survival, eventually became his downfall. The very fear that had built his empire began to consume him. By the early 1990s, Bulger's once thriving empire began to show signs of unraveling. Law enforcement had started to close in on him, and rival gangs, once afraid to challenge him, began to sense an opportunity. Bulger's increasing paranoia made him more erratic, and his decisions became more impulsive. In the past, he had been able to use the system to his advantage, but now, the system was starting to turn on him. His relationship with the FBI became more strained, and his once loyal associates began to question his leadership. As the walls began to close in, Bulger made the decision to disappear. He went into hiding in 1994, vanishing without a trace and leaving behind a city and a criminal empire in chaos. His disappearance was a carefully planned move, one that would allow him to escape the consequences of his actions while still maintaining his grip on power. For years, his name became synonymous with mystery, a figure who had seemingly disappeared into thin air. The hunt for Bulger, which began as a search for a fugitive, soon became a national obsession. Despite the massive resources devoted to finding him, Bulger managed to remain one step ahead, living in the shadows for 16 years. His ability to evade capture became legendary, and the longer he remained at large, the more mythic his story became. Bulger, once seen as the king of Boston's criminal world, was now a ghost, a fugitive whose very name struck fear into the hearts of those who had once been his allies and enemies alike. But even as he lived in hiding, the damage he had caused to the people of Boston continued to linger. The lives he had destroyed, the families he had ruined, and the corruption he had spread throughout the city would leave a legacy that could not be erased, even if he was never found. In 2011, after years of searching, the FBI finally tracked Bulger down in Santa Monica, California. His capture marked the end of a chapter in a story that had spanned decades. For many, it was a moment of triumph, a sense of justice finally being served. But for others, it was a reminder of the deep flaws in the system that had allowed him to remain free for so long. Bulger's capture, while a victory for law enforcement, also underscored the tragic reality of how deeply corruption had become entrenched in both the criminal world and the institutions meant to stop it. Bulger's trial revealed the full extent of his crimes, exposing the many murders, extortion schemes, and betrayals that defined his career. But for all the attention the trial garnered, it was also a moment of reckoning for the families of his victims. They had lived in the shadows of his power for so long, waiting for the justice that had been so long delayed. Now, they could finally confront the man who had taken so much from them. But Bulger, ever defiant, showed little remorse for his actions. He remained a man defined by his need for control, a man who had used fear and manipulation as tools to get everything he wanted, and now, in his final years, it was clear that nothing had changed. Even as he stood in the courtroom, he remained unrepentant, unwilling to face the consequences of his actions. In 2018, Bulger's life came to an end while serving a sentence in a federal prison. His death marked the final chapter of a life defined by violence, manipulation, and fear. But even in death, his legacy lived on. The story of Whitey Bulger, a man who had woven a web of deceit, terror, and power, would continue to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrosive effects of corruption. His reign may have ended, but the lessons of his rise and fall remain etched in the history of Boston, and in the annals of criminal history.